Hello and welcome to Magda Knits. My name is Magda and I'm coming to you from the southeast of England, and this is my little space on the internet where I talk about all of my knitting, yarn spinning and fiber dyeing. In today's episode I would like to feature one finished object, which is a vest for my partner that I have been knitting for the last few weeks. I will also update you on what I have on my needles at the moment, and I'm going to show you some yarn which I spun and hand dyed myself. So let's start off with the finished object. Or actually, before I do show you the finished object, in case you're wondering what I'm wearing, this is the Misty morning Cardi that I have knitted a few months ago. It's a design by Zanete knits, and I have been talking about this in my previous episodes, so I'm going to put information on the screen in case you want to have a look back and hear more about the construction and my experiences of knitting this cardigan. It's actually my favorite knitted garment ever, and I literally live in it. So I figured I'm just gonna wear it because I love it and it's really comfortable. And actually maybe it's a good time to report back on how it's been wearing and how the yarn has been holding up. This has been knit in the Woolly Knit Natural Breeds DK, I think. Either way, unfortunately this yarn I believe is discontinued because I haven't seen it on their website anymore. I got this yarn last year during their Black Friday sales, which by the way was pretty amazing, so I'm really keeping my eyes peeled for the sales this year. Hopefully they will have some amazing deals again. But yeah, this yarn has been holding up extremely well. There is maybe a little bit of pilling here and there, although not much really. Considering how much I've been wearing this, it's in a perfect condition, and I think this cardigan is going to stay with me for many years to come. So I would highly recommend this pattern, and I would highly recommend this yarn if you could ever get hold of it. Perhaps there are still some skeins available in some random shops, or perhaps people have them in their stashes. If you do, I cannot recommend this yarn enough. But anyway, let's jump onto the finished object and what I wanted to talk about this episode mainly. So this is a completed vest that I have knitted for my partner. The design is called Neat, and it is a design by James McIntosh. I will put a picture of the full garment because, as you can see, it's quite big, so you won't be able to kind of see it in its full glory. But yeah, as I said, it is a vest. This has been knitted in the Drops Lima yarn, and I will talk about the yarn and experience of knitting with it in a moment. I have been knitting this on the 375mm needles, and I have knitted this in size 4, which I think the finished garment is around 118 or 112, I think, centimeters across the chest. And I have used, I think, around 9.5 balls of Drops Lima for this project. This yarn comes in a 50-gram ball. So yeah, this is how much I used for this project. I have gotten this yarn, I think, during sales, so I didn't spend a large amount of money on this. And I also got a few extra balls, which I am actually using on my current whip, which I will show you in a minute. So this is the finished object. This design is actually, or this project is designed to be knit flat, and it is designed bottom up. Now, I did not fancy doing all the purling on this project, so I decided to convert it to knit in a round. And because it's a bottom-up construction, it was extremely easy to do it. Essentially, I just casted on the number of stitches that was needed for the front and the back, and I joined in the round, and I just kept going in the round, until I reached the point where you have to start shaping the armholes. So at that point I have put the front on the stitch holder, and then I started to deal with the back separately first. That was the point where I had to start knitting flat, but obviously it wasn't as bad as if I had to knit the whole thing flat and do all this purling. After I was done with shaping the back, so obviously for the back, at that point I would just follow the instructions as they were, because at that point I was knitting flat, so it was the point where you would just follow the instructions exactly as they were. When I was done with the back, then I did exactly the same thing for the front, and then I put it all together, picked up the stitches around the neckline, did a little bit of ribbing, and I did the same for the armholes here as well. I, as usual, am not particularly happy with how I ended up knitting the neckline. I don't know what it is about me and necklines, I just always end up knitting them really tight. Maybe I should stop going down needle size for my ribbing. For some reason, I end up knitting my ribbing quite tight. So maybe this is a note for me for the future that I should stop doing that. Maybe I should try a bigger size needle, because that neck opening is fairly small. Luckily I was doing the Italian bind off, which is a fairly stretchy bind off, and so it's big enough so that my partner can actually put his head through. But yeah, it happens especially when I knit bottom up and then I have to pick up the stitches and do the ribbing. I dislike picking up the stitches. I always struggle with it. It never looks as neat and nice. I guess with this project I could get away with quite a lot because it is made in the black yarn. But yeah, if I look closely, I probably could have done a better job. But the intention of this garment is to wear it underneath his work clothes, so at the end of the day it doesn't matter whether it has some imperfections or not, because no one is going to be really inspecting it, and it's most of the time no one's really going to see it. The idea was to have a very practical piece of garment to keep him warm in winter. What I was quite happy about on this project as well is that when I switched from knitting in the round to knitting flat, I managed to keep the tension nice and consistent across the project. So actually I didn't get any rowing out effect. So I don't know if you can see the stitch definition here, to be honest, but you literally cannot tell where I switched from knitting in the round to knitting flat. So I'm extremely proud of how this whole tension ended up across the whole project. And yeah, I didn't really have to even pay that much attention to keeping the tension tight. It just felt very natural what I was doing across the whole project. So I'm super, super happy and extremely proud of how it turned out. The fitting is perfect. It has just a little bit of positive ease, but it's not an oversized vest or anything like that. So super happy, and I am looking forward to seeing my partner wearing this on a regular basis. It will be interesting to see how the yarn behaves. So as I mentioned, this yarn is Drops Lima. So it is a blend of alpaca and wool. I have knitted in a similar or in exactly the same blend in Drops yarn before, however it was a Drops Flora. So if you are a returning viewer, then you probably know that a few months ago I have knitted a cardigan for myself in Drops Lima, which is also an alpaca and wool blend, and that cardigan stretched ridiculously. I was trying to figure out why. I guess alpaca was the main culprit, but since then I managed to figure things out a little bit in more depth with the help of other people as well. So essentially when I was knitting this garment, I was really trying to figure out what exactly it is that I should be doing to prevent this garment from stretching, or if there was nothing to do, or if there was absolutely no way of avoiding the stretching, then perhaps I should take that into consideration and perhaps knit it shorter. So I was playing with the idea for a very long time, trying to figure out how long it should be. The good thing is that my partner really didn't mind the length, because he is going to wear it underneath his work clothes, so if it ends up being a little bit too long, that's fine. He will probably have it tucked into his trousers anyway, so the length didn't particularly matter. What ended up happening here is the length did not change at all. So the size of this garment, especially when it comes to the length, it actually is exactly the same as it was pre-washing. Now, there was something that I did slightly differently to what I had with the Lenore cardigan, which stretched. First of all, there was a little bit of a conversation on the Slack channel of Nikki's Knitting with Cat Hair podcast. Someone was talking about an alpaca fiber. I think we ended up talking a little bit about alpaca blend and whatnot. And Alexandra of the November Woods Fiber Co., who, by the way, also used to have a podcast, but I haven't really seen her posting any new episodes. But she's a very lovely person, and she seems to be she seems to have a lot of knowledge about knitting in general. What she mentioned is she described her experience of knitting with alpaca, and she found that whenever she knitted at a tighter gauge, then the garments didn't tend to stretch that much, and it potentially has something to do with the staple length of the fiber. And that made me really curious, actually, because when I think back on my Lenore cardigan, I was actually knitting this at a very loose gauge. And when I talk about loose gauge, I don't necessarily mean like the width of the stitches or like the number of stitches on the needle. It's more about how much I tend to pull my stitches. So my knitting tends to be quite long, or like if you looked at the stitch, it tends to be quite long. I guess I tend to knit quite loosely and I don't pull the yarn very much. Whereas with this project, I was pulling a little bit tighter and I was trying not to make those stitches longer. And I think that pretty much worked. It did not stretch, and I think this might be the advice, or at least advice for myself. I'm no expert on alpaca fiber by no means, but it's something that I will definitely keep in mind if I work with alpaca fiber in the future. I will just try to keep that gauge tight. I think why Lenore also stretched, it just kind of occurred to me the other day, is because I had a lot of color work on the bottom part of this cardigan. So there was a lot of fiber and a lot of yarn on the bottom section, which just pulled the fiber down and stretched the whole garment. I had some handspun yarn in that section as well, which was quite dense and quite heavy, and I think that just contributed to the overall length of this project as well. Together with the loose stitches, it just ended up being a very long cardigan. But on this project, I'm super happy how it looks and what I ended up with. Of course, it may all change once my partner starts wearing it. He didn't get the chance of wearing it just yet, partly because I finished this fairly recently. The other reason is also the weather is still fairly mild, so there was no need for him to wear it just yet. But hopefully soon he can start wearing it, and then it will be interesting to see if it loses its shape and whether it stretches. The pattern itself was, in my opinion, quite well written. I love the fit of this vest, and I am really contemplating of knitting another one of these, but just turning it into a sweater. So I might just pick up the sleeves and just add full-length sleeves to another of those garments. It was fun. I actually quite enjoyed it. It was miles and miles of stockinette, and it is very much something that I enjoy. So it was a lot of mindless knitting. The yarn itself, it's got a nice stitch definition. You can't quite see it because it's black, but if I was to use any other color, I think it would have a really lovely stitch definition. The yarn is well spun. It doesn't really split. I did split it in a couple of places, but that was purely because I wasn't looking at what I was doing. So it was during one of those TV knitting moments, and when I realized that some of the stitches split, I was too many rows up, because normally if I do something like this, I will drop the stitches and pick them up again. But if it's too many rows in, I tend not to do it, because for some reason then you begin to notice where I actually drop the stitches and pick them up. So there are a couple of places where a tiny bit of yarn sticks out from the fabric, but it's okay. As I said, no one's going to notice, because it is very much to be used as like an undergarment. So yeah, so this is the finished vest for my partner, and now I'm going to show you what I am working on at the moment. So one of the projects that I'm currently working on is actually knitted in exactly the same yarn that I was just showing you in the Drops Lima, and I am actually knitting a pair of leggings. So I mentioned this before, that I wanted to knit leggings, so I am very much in the middle of the process. I have one of the legs probably like halfway through. The yarn that I'm using is actually the recommended yarn from this project, and I am on a gauge. I have tried this on already and it fits perfectly. Obviously on leggings you want to have some negative ease, so it all kind of fits very nicely as it stretches. And it's got a little section of like a cable design on the side, which actually you can see. I was a little bit worried that perhaps with the black yarn that cable is not going to be visible, but actually you can see it. But it's not it wasn't the main feature of why I wanted to knit this these leggings, so if they were not visible I wouldn't be particularly worried about it. But I'm very, very excited about this project, and I'm looking forward to finishing it and start wearing them. As always, I will talk about this project in more detail when I finish them, so that will be something to talk about in my next episode. What I did want to show you though, I wanted to show you those cords that I have here on my knitting. So these cords are to hold live stitches basically, and you probably have heard various podcasters talking about the knitting barber cords. I think they're called cords. And at the same time, you probably have heard other podcasters talking about the fact that you don't really have to get the knitting barber cords, because they are fairly expensive and you can find substitutes. So this is very much a substitute that I wanted to show you, and I wanted to kind of guide you on how to get them, because it was a little bit of a struggle for me to find them. When I watched podcasters who talked about the substitutes, they mentioned cords that you can buy from those like jewelry making stores, and essentially I think originally they are designed for like jewelry making, but I really struggled to understand why you should type into Google to find these. I couldn't find anything. When I was typing like jewelry making cords or something like that, I would end up with like, you know, like the rope type cords, and not the hollow ones that you would need for keeping these live stitches on. By the way, actually, something maybe that I also wanted to mention, because when these kind of came about for the first time, when I saw them for the first time, I kind of struggled to understand how they were supposed to be used. And I don't think, of all the people that I watched talking about them, I don't think I've seen anyone who actually showed how they used them. So for a very long time I was kind of thinking like, how are they different to having like the cord from the interchangeable needles? Like, why are these so much better? And then I realized like how they are actually used. So for those of you who don't know how to use them, essentially the great thing about them is that you can slide your stitches, your live stitches, off the needles. So let me just undo that knot, because I just did the knot so that I don't lose my stitches. But essentially, if you wanted to try on your knitting, and imagine that this this leg was actually already sitting on the needles, or actually let me do it like this. So I've got my stitches here on my needles, and let's say I want to try these on. And let's pretend that I'm knitting these on a short circular needles. So this would be very easy to try on because I've got plenty of cord. But if you were to knit these on the short needles, obviously the cord could potentially be too short to put your leg through it. So what you can do in this case, you take these cords, and because they are like silicone or rubber, they stretch quite a lot, so you put the tips onto your needles, you push really hard, and you do it for both, and then you could just slide your knitting onto the cords. So this way you've got more cord and you can put your leg through it, or if you put this, these cords around the circumference of your sweater, for example, then you will be able to put it like through your shoulders and whatnot. So essentially that's the good thing about these, that you basically can just slide your stitches, and it's super easy. If you want to put these back on, then again you just attach and then you just slide your stuff in and then remove, and that's it. So I mean, I really did struggle to understand how to use them until, as I said, I realized what they're for. But anyway, going back to these specific ones. So they are not the Knitting Barber. I managed to finally find what I should be typing into Google or in the search to find them. And I am going to put the link to the Etsy shop, which I got these from. But what you can search for, what I searched for, I typed silicone hollow cord, or you can type maybe rubber hollow cord. When I typed that in, finally I got the results that looked more like something that I was after. And surprise, surprise, I paid £2.58 for this, free postage on Etsy, 5 meters long. So I'm not trying to say that Knitting Barber is bad. I have never had these in my hands. I've never seen them. Perhaps they are much better quality. Perhaps they are a great design, you know, they have some great design features. I don't know. So I'm not, you know, trying to be negative about this. What I'm trying to say is that if you cannot afford them, there are alternatives, and that's how you can find them. So if you are in UK and if you want to purchase from the same place where I purchased mine for £2, I think 58, free postage, then you can follow the link that I added in the description below. If you are based somewhere else, perhaps the postage maybe will be a bit too expensive, or the person doesn't send internationally, I'm not sure, but perhaps if you type into Etsy or I don't know, eBay, or just Google hollow silicone cords, then perhaps you can find something similar very cheap. The great thing about these is that they look very thin, but as I say, they are very stretchy. So I have successfully used these on, I think, like 3.25 millimeter needles, or even 3 millimeter needles. And I can also fit them on, I think I did it on like 5 millimeter needles as well. So they stretch quite a lot. So I think this is a really great product, great value for money. As I say, 5 meters, it's so much. I chopped these into like different lengths, and I have like one really long one that I would use on a sweater. I've got shorter ones that I would use on for sleeves, and I still have plenty left for anything else that I would like to use these for. One thing maybe just to be mindful of, I use wooden needles, so I use the Knit Pro Symphony, so perhaps I am able to use these on on a variety of sizes of needles. Perhaps if you tend to knit with metal needles, maybe they will slide a little bit more. You would have to play around and experiment, but I have never lost any stitches. They never slid off my needles ever, so I think that's a pretty cool thing. I did notice as well that they have them in the hobby shop. I think originally I wanted to get this from hobby. I think it's £3.50 perhaps. I don't know how long these cords are in hobby. But at that time I didn't really want to buy anything else from their website, so I couldn't really justify the postage. I think they are based somewhere in Europe, so the postage was a little bit expensive for what I was buying. So yeah, so then I found it on Etsy, and I got these, and I'm super happy with them. And yeah, if you ever thought about getting these cords, then I would highly recommend looking for cheaper alternatives. However, if you obviously can afford the knitting barber, then why not, you know, supporting a brand. I actually don't know anything about that company, so I don't know whether they are a brand to support, but yeah, just wanted to throw it out there. Anyway, this is coming in my next episode. And what I also have at the moment on my needles, which is going to be a long-standing project, is the Coziest Memories blanket, which I was showing you in my previous episode, but I ripped back because I was using fingering weight yarn together with DK weight for the borders, and I just figured I didn't like the fabric, so I ripped it back, and now I am knitting everything in DK weight, so if I have any fingering weight scraps, I hold them double. And I have quite a lot now. It will be a challenge to show it to you because, yeah, it's just loads of squares. And I don't know how many squares I have across. I think it might be 10. But yeah, it's so addictive. I love this project so much, to the point that I have to restrain myself from knitting more squares. I made a decision that I want to knit just one square a day, and I try to hold on to it purely because when I started this project, I was also knitting on the vest for my partner, and that was much more important to complete than completing this blanket. So as I say, I had to stop myself at some point because I just wanted to keep adding more squares. It's very much popcorn knitting, and it's a bit like knitting on like self-striping yarn, or if you're knitting color work, you just want to go one more row just to see how it's going to look like, and you just want to keep adding more squares. But yeah, I take a lot of pleasure in this project, and as I said, it's a great stash busting design. I'm using quite a lot of my Handspun and my hand-dyed yarn, so all those little scraps that I would have that would come off my wheel, that I would chain ply, and I would have no use for, they just come into this project. So I've got my Handspun here, I've got my Handspun here, I think this is my Handspun, that's my Handspun here. Yeah, I'm not gonna talk you through every single of those squares because that would be just incredibly boring, but yeah, this is coming along, and I thought I'll just check in to show you what I've got. So the great thing about this project is you can make it as big as you wish, and if you change your mind, so I've got I think 10 squares across here, but if I wanted to all of a sudden make it 15 or 20 or whatever, it's so easy to just keep adding squares because each of these is knit separately. Yeah, so I will probably keep showing you this project every now and again just to kind of check in and show you where I am. And yeah, so that was all of my current projects that I'm working on, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about yarn spinning. So if you are a returning viewer, then you know I've been spinning some yarn to knit a Shifty sweater by Andrea Mowry. And I had a full bag of Rayland fiber that I scoured during summer months, and then I dyed it, I carded it, and then I spun it. I ended up with something that looked fairly pretty, or at least I thought at that time. I thought it would work. But as I started spinning my contrasting colors, things just did not look very well together. So I had to change my mind. I will insert a picture of the yarn that I had originally for the background color for Shifty. As I say, it kind of worked in theory, but every skein ended up looking slightly different because all the little colored fibers that I was blending in to the main natural color it just ended up being slightly different shade, and I had different amounts of that contrasting color, so every skein looked very different. And at one point I ended up with lots of blue and orange fiber, which after blending just didn't look really great. But I have decided on the contrasting colors, so that was something that I really held on to, and I really wanted to have those in my Shifty sweater. And when I started swatching, I realized that the background colors didn't work at all. So let me first show you the contrasting colors. So this is the first contrasting color that I spun. This is, I think that was the Polworth that I finished fairly recently. So I hand dyed this fiber and then I spun it into a 3-ply. Is it a 3-ply? Yeah, that's a 3-ply. And then I dyed another piece of fiber that I was meant to have it as a second color, but the fiber ended up being too bright and it just didn't go well with this. So I kind of wanted to go for something green, but I wanted to have like dark green, and what I ended up with was very bright. So this is the skein that I spun of the green fiber. I very early realized that this was not going to work, but I just wanted to spin it for the sake of spinning and creating this yarn, because in itself I think it's a pretty color. It just wouldn't go well with this, at least not for me. I think the sweater would be just way too crazy. This is also a 3-ply, and this is a blue-faced Leicester fiber. I love spinning blue-faced Leicester. It's lovely to spin and it creates a very pleasant yarn. Yeah, so this is the finished skein. But as I said, it didn't really go well together, and at that time I was getting a little bit frustrated because I didn't want to experiment with yet another fiber, which perhaps after finishing would end up not matching this very well. So I dived into my stash to see what I have already spun, and then I found this. So this I spun months ago. It was hand dyed by me as well, and it was 100% merino fiber. I think they will complement each other. Perhaps there will be places where they will kind of become fairly similar to one another, but I think it should work fairly well. So when I started swatching with these two, and the main color that I had, the white-ish color, I was getting too much contrast. I really didn't like it. I didn't want a sweater with so much contrast. So I figured I could either... First I was thinking of ditching the idea of Shifty altogether for the time being. So I knew these two would become Shifty one day, but I really wanted to make use of that sweater quantity of fiber that I spun for the white color. But when I thought maybe I'm just gonna knit a plain stockinette sweater from that. But when I started swatching in plain stockinette, I didn't like the fiber either. The colors just didn't really run very nicely. The colors looked a bit weird. The skeins looked very different to one another, so you would really see where I was changing the skeins. And I really don't like to alternate skeins, so I didn't want to do that either. And then I just decided to over dye it. And what does Magda do when she doesn't know what to do with color? Obviously, she plonks everything into brown dye. And that's what I did. So I put those skeins into brown dye, and I ended up with this, which I really like. Okay, I know that some of you will laugh at me. I'm looking at you, Emily, for over dyeing everything in brown, but come on, I think it's a nice color, and I think it is going to look nice with the other two colors. I'm going to show them to you all together in a second, but yeah, let me first show you the color of this yarn. It ended up being a little bit variegated, and that's very much the feature of hand-dyed yarn very often, especially when I dye it, but I am going to be totally honest with you. The dark brown bits that you see, that's burnt yarn, basically. I burnt it. So it's not that the dye absorbed here more for whatever chemical reasons, it's because I burnt it. Luckily it didn't felt, and it doesn't feel different than where it feels in other places. But essentially, yeah, we have a really stupid cooker, and even on the smallest settings, the temperature is a little bit high. So when I'm dyeing fiber, I have to be really careful, and I have to keep checking on the temperature, and I have to switch off the cooker before it reaches like a boiling point. So I successfully kept doing this for this yarn. By the way, all of them have burnt pieces, so at least that's something similar across all of them. But yeah, when I checked this fiber at one point, I was nearly done with the dyeing process, and then I realized there was still a little bit dye left in the dye bath. So I was thinking, okay, I'm just going to put the heating up a little bit more again. And I'm just going to try to exhaust all of the dye. And then I forgot about the fiber. So when I remembered about it, it was pretty much boiling at that point. And all those bits where you can see it burned so much, that was basically where the yarn was like directly over the hobs. So I'm dyeing my fiber in like this rectangular pan, and so it kind of fits across two hobs. And yeah, those bits were just directly over the hobs where the temperature obviously was much higher. So I'm just having here a very variegated yarn. I don't know how this is going to knit. I did swatch, but obviously a swatch, when it's such a small square, it doesn't really give you the flavor of what the bigger garment is going to be, how the colors are going to distribute. So hopefully I will not end up with too much pooling, but it could be. I don't know, maybe I will be forced to alternate skeins. I do not know, but we shall see. But yeah, so this is going to become my Shifty sweater, and it is going to be spun. It's going to be knitted after I'm done with my leggings. And yeah, this is basically the color palette. So I've got one more skein here, which I've already caked up, and those are the colors that my Shifty is going to have. I am slightly worried that perhaps there will be some similarities across those different yarns. I don't know if I will have enough contrast, but in the worst case I could cut out sections. I don't know. But yeah, background color and two contrasting colors. I'm very excited to cast on. I'm also very excited to cast on purely just to have a finished sweater from this yarn, because I'm extremely curious to see how the Raylan fiber wears and how it feels. It's not the softest yarn, but it's not particularly unpleasant or itchy, and I just absolutely loved the process of spinning it. The drafting is an absolute pleasure. The final yarn is very elastic, so there is quite a lot of elasticity in it, and it just blooms really nicely. And if this ends up being a very pleasant sweater to wear, I might even have found my favorite fiber, because I just absolutely loved every minute of spinning with it. I still have a few bats left of this fiber, so I might just dye it in some other colors and just use it for something else. But for now, yeah, this is just going to become a Shifty sweater. And as I say, I will report back on how this is going. Probably in my next episode, when the leggings are finished, I will probably cast this on already, so I will show you a little work in progress, most likely. So yeah, so that was a very quick check-in just to show you guys what I'm up to. And yeah, as always, if you guys want to find me elsewhere and if you would like to reach out and say hi, I am around on Instagram and on Ravelry as Magda Knits with double S at the end. And if you would like to subscribe to this channel to hear more about my adventures with knitting and spinning, then I would be forever happy. if you hit that subscribe button, and if you liked this video, that always helps the channel grow. So thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for spending some time with me, and I will see you next time. Bye!